Hey guys, what is up? Swim here, and we are doing Meta Mondays. Now, I know this might be confusing to some of you guys, seeing as it's Tuesday. And I will say, this one came out a day late, and it's actually not the first one, but there's been some minor delays. Like, listen, look, yesterday, I was like, I could have done it, but the data wasn't in yet. I wanted to make sure that we had the highest degree of accuracy we could, rather than just trying to rush it out to get it on schedule. So, as you guys know, this is a segment that I do once a week, basically talking about where the meta's at, what decks are better this week, what decks are worse this week. To aid this goal, we are using some mobalytic stats and talking with a lot of other top players. In this case, we actually, here's a bit of a, spoiler for later, did a bit of a matchup table. Now, it's not based on, pure data. A lot of it is just anecdotal. I talked with, probably about 8 other top players, and basically, they give varying degrees of input, and we decided, so-and-so deck beat so-and-so deck. We'll show that later, and that's going to be really exciting. As a new addition this week, we're kind of ramping up. The series is actually getting more and more features every week, and I'm looking forward to, what things will look like a couple of weeks from now. Okay, so, to get into it, first up, let's bring up the tier list. So this is kind of like my personal tier list on my site, and effectively, some of these decks are going to need some tweaks, but as we can see, some of the bigger changes this week, well, one of the biggest ones is that Ephemeral Midrange is being bumped up, and that's going to be a deck that, if you know Teal Red's deck, it's kind of similar, although it's not like that exact deck, and it's also a deck that I've been playing a lot of if you watch my stream for the past week and a half, 2 weeks or so. We see Spider Aggro on the rise as well, and we also have, decks like War Mother's Control and Spooky Karma that are probably getting worse and worse. They're kind of like the super control decks are definitely getting somewhat phased out. They were very popular early on, but of course you do see a lot of control decks that have kind of more developed mid-range game plans, like Heimerdinger Karma and Karma Lux, that tend to be doing just fine at the top of tier 2. Now, this is ordered by general strength, so top of tier 1, top of tier 2 are going to be a bit stronger than lower down. Alright, so getting right into it, let's go deck by deck. So, Ephemeral Midrange, currently at the top, but could be close to it. This is my version of the concept. I ended up settling this after playing for, a couple of weeks of this on and off. I didn't spend a couple of weeks total playing this, but for the past couple of weeks, let me go ahead and move this so that it's a little bit more visible. There we go. Okay, so, and basically the idea here is, it's just kind of like a normal mid-range package. It's using a lot of the Shadow Isles tools. This isn't a super original concept. Months ago, there were people running kind of like Hecarim Zed with just, sometimes the Deathmark combo. Zed helps the Deathmark combo. Sometimes you can do Mark of the Isles into Deathmark on Zed, get a really buffed Zed permanently. That's pretty good. Obviously, Darkwater Scourge Deathmark is a big combo. You can use Oblivious Islander on Cursed Keeper. That's pretty good. You can use it on Darkwater Scourge to save you mana for the Deathmark turn. That's pretty good. You can use Oblivious Islander on Hecarim so that you can play Hecarim on turn 5, attack with it, and then Rekindler it on turn 6. That's pretty good. You can use Dawn of Dusk on pretty much the Cursed Keeper, or more likely the Hecarim, sometimes a blowout combo with Greenglade Duo. Basically, the thing to understand about this deck is everything combos with everything else, right? You just have a ton of pieces, and there's just so much you can do, right? For example, the way you win against Ezreal is you just use Dawn of Dusk on Hecarim, and you're pretty much good to go. They usually can't really counter that. Maybe they'll freeze it, but then, all of the Hecarims are just going to, level up anyway and summon all the Riders, and then there's not really a great way for them to stave off that pressure. And you basically just have a bunch of super scalable pieces. I do want to point out that when you play Greenglade Duo, and then you do Mark Dawn of Dusk on it, if the opponent doesn't see it coming, if they're playing an archetype that can't really answer that combo, that's a huge blowout. They will just lose the game on turn 5, right? It's just over. And this is also basically the same combo that an older deck of mine was also using. So this is overall, a very powerful deck. It's got a powerful win rate, and yes, we'll go into the win rates of the decks a little bit later as well, but this is most definitely a tier 1 list. Okay, so back to the sheet, and we've got, you know, kind of like these are the decks that you've seen on tier 1 last week. Kinko Elusives, Fearsome Rally, and Ezreal. I'm just gonna kind of like breeze over these because they really haven't changed much. Kinko Elusives, played around with it a little bit. I ended up liking the 3 Hatchling 0 Battle Fury version, which I think is a pretty solid version of Kinko Elusives right now. One thing I want to say about this list is that it is being shown that there are many different ways to splash these 2 cards for the other color. You don't need to play it as a Freljord deck. And, you know, it does create a lot of opportunities. For example, I was messing around with playing this deck with Teemo and used Cask Salesman as well as Sparring Student, which is actually pretty powerful. There was a Teemo version of this list that hit like number 2 on Masters as well a couple of weeks ago. I know Manu S has messed around with running Precious Pet and Brothers Bond in these slots in like a Nox splash version, and I know some people have like messed around with like a Shadow Isles splash as well. And lastly, one of the things I tried was effectively just running Relentless Pursuit from Demacia and, you know, just putting in like Sparring Student. Overall, the decks are excuse me, the variants of the deck are all going to perform about the same. Honestly, they're not going to be like super crazy different. Overall, it's hard to say which one is the best, but right now the most stats we have for are like the Omen Hawk version. This is kind of like the most tried and true version of the list, so it's still the one I'm going to be recommending, although that might change next week. I will point out that, you know, if you like this deck, you can definitely experiment with flexing out those 2 specific slots for anything that I've mentioned. Okay, next up, we of course have Fearsome Rally. So Fearsome Rally, it's a deck, you know, we all know and love, and this is my current version of the deck. Now, of course, it's gone through just a couple of changes in the past several days, but for the most part, I mean, listen, look. If you play Runeterra, you've seen this deck before. It's very popular, you know, especially with just, you know, you can kind of splash Wraithcaller with a few colors. It's gone through some different forms. You know, it's at one point we were using like Ionia with Deny. I never really liked that version. The PNZ version was the cool thing to play for a week, and for the past 2 weeks, people have been playing Relentless Pursuit with a few different ways to top end it. In this case, I like the version with Redeemer as well as Guardian with just a 1 of Detain to help out the mirrors. Whenever you can, you know, have a Hecarim and your opponent plays Hecarim and you detain their Hecarim, it's a huge blowout potential in the mirror. Like, they can't rekindle it either because it's not technically dead. So that's a pretty big deal, and there's a lot of ways you can gain value out of that. And we also have like 1 Harrowing just to be able to burst out games that are going just a little bit later at this point in time. And honestly, do I have to explain the rest of the deck? It's like, listen, look, it's the deck. It does what it says on the tin. It's everything about the deck is just very, very cookie cutter. We've seen it before. It's basically you just spam the board with kind of like very, very efficient units. It's just like, you know, kind of like a mid-range zoo-ish style of deck, and effectively you're just going to be winning value trades and putting out a lot of pressure early, right? So that's going to be the Fearsome deck. And then we've got Ezreal, which is actually a really, really interesting component here. So when I did the Meta Mondays last week, I put Ezreal at the bottom of tier 1, and I made sure to clarify it's close, right? Whether he's like the bottom of tier 1 or the top of tier 2. And I ended up actually, right after I recorded the Meta Mondays, I ended up deciding that he was just a tiny bit too weak, and I ended up bumping him to the top of tier 2 instead. Here, let me make sure this is showing properly. And then I sat on it for a few more days, and I ended up bumping him back to tier 1. Really, it's very close between the two, and it depends on how, you know, we're interpreting the data. I've talked with a lot of people about this, and I think most people do tend to agree that Ezreal is tier 1. This is an extremely powerful deck, although it is prone to misplaying. You know, you do need to make sure you're playing it correctly, and there's a few counterintuitive things about it. Most importantly, you want to be making sure you're playing Ezreal late, not playing him too early, and effectively just like making sure the game is stalled out, like that 1 extra turn you're going to need. This deck has also taken some improvements in the past week or so. Currently, my version is as so, down to 1 Get Excited, 1 Rummage, 1 Marksman, and 1 Kindly Tavern Keeper. This ability to heal your Nexus for 3 or heal an Elnuck for 3 actually, I think, proves very flexible and ends up being, in my opinion, a no-brainer in the deck. Okay, so right now Ezreal ends up just sneaking into tier 1, I would say, and we'll talk about this on, like, you know, the win rate tables, and we'll talk about this on the matchup tables later, just so we can, you know, discuss why exactly I think it ends up being tier 1. Then we've got Spider Aggro. This is a deck that it's doing very, very well right now. I'm tenuously putting this at tier 2, but it actually could end up being a tier 1 list moving forward. That's very, very possible. It's kind of the same position like Ezreal was in, where it's like it's either top of tier 2 or bottom of tier 1. This deck is definitely on the rise, and this is my personal version of it, which is I think it's very similar to a version by Nick Mix Plays, which was top 3 about a week ago. Again, I mean, there's nothing really innovative happening here. Like, if you're looking at the list, you're like, okay, this is just any other Spiders list. Yeah, this is just, I mean, it really is just any other Spiders list. There's nothing crazy going on. It's just, in this case, we're running 2 Battlecasters. After this card got buffed, it was pretty good. And 3 Crawling Sensations. Some of the older Spider lists are running, like, very few or 0 Crawling Sensations, and I'm a really big fan of 2 or 3 Crawling Sensations in this kind of aggro list. That's probably actually the biggest change we have here. Overall, this is a deck with a high win rate. We'll see the win rates later when we get into that. And it does a good job at, like, cleaning up a lot of different things in the meta as well. Okay, then we've got Heimerdinger Karma. Pretty standard stuff. I'm only going to do the tier 1 and tier 2 decks, by the way. I'll kind of, like, brush over the tier 3s, but I'm not going to go over them individually. So Heimerdinger Karma, whoa, I've really got to move this screen so you guys can see these. That's a lot of spells. Okay. So, effectively, this is like Raptor's old version of Heimerdinger Karma, and it's still the version that most people are running. It did get bumped down quite a bit. I was thinking right after the patch that this is a deck that could be tier 1, and it's kind of felt lower and lower as time went on, but it still ends up being a fairly solid tier 2 deck. This is probably I would say a little weaker than the Lux Karma, although I need to refresh the page because it should be below the Lux Karma. It just hasn't updated yet. And it's pretty straightforward. You're using, you know, Heimerdinger and Karma. You're casting a lot of spells to stall the game out, and you're going to win the game with these value engines. You run an abundance of 3 mana spells to make sure that your Heimerdinger is going to be able to generate all the cards, specifically the, God, what's it called? Floor Be Gone? The one that's good. The elusive 3-1. It's like, can block elusives, can block fearsome, can just go face and win the game. So, that's pretty much the game plan here. Not super much to talk about. Okay. Then there's Karma Lux. Now, there's a few versions of Karma Lux going around. I think Trudon and Nine both have, like, somewhat different versions, but out of them, this is the one I prefer, which is based on Trudon's version. And I think it's only like 1 card different or something. I'll just call this Trudon's version. And effectively, the idea behind this deck is, you know, it's stalling the game, winning with some elusives game plan, and you're going to kind of resort to kind of like a plan B of the kind of like control engine game plan if elusives don't work out, right? So, for example, like Elusive Burn, you might notice Elusive Burn, an older deck that kind of no longer appears on this tier list. It's sort of been replaced by this deck, and effectively, what's been decided is that when you have, like, so there's a triangle of, like, Solitary Monk, Standalone, Relentless Pursuit, and the thing is, if you draw these 3 cards, you've kind of won the game on turn 5, and there's only a few things that can stop this from winning the game on turn 5, right? Like, if your opponent's not playing Ionia, there's literally, like, 2 cards in the meta that can stop this from being, like, a turn 5 win outside of Ionia, right? Because, of course, you just buff this to 7, and then you hit them 3 times, and the third one being with the Relentless Pursuit, right? So, this deck kind of has that combo, super early game kill combo option, but it has kind of a better backup plan, which is, you know, the main plan of the deck, how most games are going to play out, which is, you know, when you don't have a super aggressive kill combo, you're just going to go ahead and like stall out with Karma and Lux, make sure you're generating infinite value, and you've got some good buff targets with the standalone as well, those being, you know, Kinko Lifeblade, more dependent on buffs than ever now that he's a 4-mana 2/2 without Mentor, and Emerald's Awakener. Also in the same boat, he's got Lifesteal, he's also a 2/2, so you can use standalone on him, and a 3-mana 5/5 Lifesteal, well, it's kind of like a Darkwater Scourge, right? Now, you're kind of you're getting to the Darkwater Scourge in a bit of a roundabout way. It's like the same thing, you should think about it, right? It's like 2 3-mana cards for a 5/5 Lifesteal. The difference is Deathmark, of course, kills a unit, which is going to be better naturally, but these combo pieces might stand a little bit better on their own. Standalone is very useful on other things, and Emerald's Awakener, you can play it in the late game as a 3-mana 6/6 with Lifesteal, which is, of course, pretty crazy. Yeah, for the most part, this is a deck it's a little newer, so I'm not as sure what to think about it in terms of the tier list, in terms of the matchup tables, but it is showing itself to be a powerful tier 2 list, and it definitely has potential to be bumped up to tier 1 as well. Then we've got Barrier Challenger. This one is based on the version by Super JJ, which you guys might actually know this list because it was kind of like popular on ladder for a few days. It's already dying down, but it was definitely like kind of like flavor of the almost a week, not even a week really. But I think this is actually a deck that has a lot of potential. Even though I listed this, you know, a little bit lower, I think this, if refined, is definitely going to stick around as like a solid tier 2 list. I'm probably gonna like play around with this and like tweak a couple of changes off of this. We will end up, we'll see. But effectively, the idea is, you know, we're playing barriers, we're playing challengers, we're combining the two, right? We're using Brightsteel Protector with challengers to get a free kill. Swiftwing Lancer is just a huge value card that I think more and more people are starting to play with. This is going to be like a super valuable tool that's going to be like ending games when they get into like the kind of like mid-game stage. And then we've even got Brightsteel Formation. Because games are going on a little bit longer here, we have the ability to kind of like end games really effectively, as long as we have the ability to stay until turn 9 and own the board, which is fairly hard to do, but this entire deck is kind of designed around doing that, right? You don't really tend to give up the board here. And, of course, we've got Shen that's going to be flipping, giving buffs every time we barrier, and Greenglade Caretaker, which sometimes just gets pretty ridiculous value with its own stat buffs, right? So it's a pretty standard kind of like, you know, challenger barrier mid-range list, everything you'd expect. And I think it actually works pretty great, especially in this meta. This is a pretty underrated archetype. Okay, then there's, you know, Spooky Karma, which it's right now it's at the top, it's at the bottom of tier 2, and War Mother's Control is at the top of tier 3. It's going to be, you know, I'm going to have to decide like exactly how I'm going to want to do that, because this could get bumped down, War Mother's Control could get bumped up. Like they're fairly close, but this is kind of like the cutoff I would make. Spooky Karma basically just being a very slow deck that's going to be running a lot of heals, and this deck will generate extremely one-sided matchup tables, if that makes sense. So like, for example, against like Fearsome and against like Kinko Elusives, it has a really hard time winning, but against like Ezreal, well, Ezreal tends to have a really hard time winning against this deck, right? So it's very polarized in its matchup tables. It's going to be usually like very favored or very unfavored in depending on the matchup. And that's kind of why it has a hard time being a high tier deck. It's a good deck to be running in tournaments if you want to like target a specific lineup potentially. You know, that can happen. But for the most part, it's a little too unreliable to be a great ladder deck at this point in time. It was very good like early on into the meta when there were a ton of people playing like the burn deck. You could like punish them out with this, and it ends up being, yeah, like I said, low tier 2. So we've seen this concept before. It's just the idea, you spam healing, you just make sure you stay alive. It's just like a super control deck with all the healing in the world, and as long as you're not dying, you will just eventually win the game by pressing the harrowing button, right? Then there's War Mother's Control. I said I wasn't going to talk about these lists, but I'll cover them very briefly. War Mother's Control in this case is going to be running. This is Alan's version, and you know it's running all the old school concepts. I think this kind of like Spooky Karma was just like an early day one deck. I don't think it's going to be meta stable at all. It's like slowing down its win rate pretty hard, and of course we see that it has the same thing as Spooky Karma, which is it was very good in the first like day or two. In the early days of the patch, you know, I don't want to say first day or two because it didn't fall off like that hard right away. But in the early days of the patch, it was very good because it slapped Burn. You know, it beat like the Burn aggro deck very well, and a lot of like the deny decks were kind of like being cut out at that time. So you know, you didn't have a lot of answers to like Ruination or War Mother's Call or even Vengeance. Overall, I think this deck just ends up being kind of like unnecessarily slow for the current meta. So it just, you know, if you've been watching my website for the past week in real time, you might notice that Spooky Karma and War Mother's Control have just been sliding down and down the tier list. Like every couple of days, they'll drop a notch, right? And then Nox Frostbite, pretty standard Frostbite list, doesn't generate great matchup tables. You know, it was kind of like a flavor of the week thing, like several weeks ago, because it was doing decently against Fearsome. But ultimately, like as that deck started to drop off, Nox Frostbite started to drop off as well. So that's generally where I'm seeing like the meta tier list at this point in time. Now, there's a couple of things that are missing from this list. There's a couple of entries that I ended up deleting. So the biggest deck that's currently missing from this list is, of course, Noxus Piltover runs on Aggro, and the reason I ended up cutting it was because it was just a worse version in almost every way to Spider Aggro. It was a pretty and there were different versions of it. The concepts of this deck were pretty powerful in like the early days of the meta, but as the meta adjusted, like the win rate started to fall off, and the matchup tables also are just like very unfavorable to the PNZ aggro version. So I ended up just like putting Spider Aggro instead. So now we can finally get into the win rate stats. Now, let's go ahead and pull this up. Let me adjust it here. And we're going to preface this in a couple of different ways. These are Mobiletic stats for the week of February 20th to 27th. So they're actually a little outdated. It's like 5 days old, you know, if you consider that outdated. Because actually a lot has changed in the meta in 5 days. So, you know, this is going to be a bit of a grain of salt kind of thing happening here. But, of course, you know, I want to show you guys the stats, and if you want the link to this stats sheet, you can find it in the pinned comment as always. Okay, so just like, you know, brief rundown, these are the regions, these are the win rates, and this is the games played, so effectively the sample size. I'm probably only going to do up to like, you know, 500 games played. That's about where I'll draw the cutoff, as always, okay? So, you know, we've got, this is War Mother's Control, very, very popular deck. This was in like the early days of the ladder. For the first couple of days of the ladder, of the new patch, the PNZ Burn deck was the most popular deck, and for the next couple of days, War Mother's Control was the most popular deck. And a large part of the reason is because it beats PNZ Burn, right? And that's, I think, a large part of where it's getting this win rate from as well, because since then, and this has been like almost, like, it's been like a week and a half since then, both decks have really, really died down, both in play rate and win rate. Then we've got Ezreal, which Ezreal, I think, is also kept a little bit back by the same deck, like the PNZ Burn deck, which, you know, we'll get to on this sheet, just because this sheet is like, it's about a week old overall. But Ezreal, as we can see, has apparently, from the time of this snapshot, from the 20th to the 27th, the second highest play rate, and also the same win rate as the War Mother's Control as well. Now, you're going to be looking at me kind of funny. You're going to be saying, well, Swim, I mean, in your, you know, these have the same win rate. They have very similar play rates, too. So why is it that Ezreal is, you know, tier 1 and War Mother's Control is tier 3? Well, I mean, Ezreal's bottom of tier 1 and War Mother's Control is top of tier 3, but the bigger reason is, A, mostly shifts that have happened in the past couple of well, not couple of weeks. It's a week to a week and a half of this like snapshot, right? Ezreal is being kept down by, of course, like the aggressive like burn deck here, because that deck is literally built to auto win against Ezreal, and this deck is also at the same time kind of getting fed by it. It's not a deck that is, I would say, super present in the meta right now. It's dying down, and it has been dying down for the past couple of weeks. And against a lot of the newcomers to the meta, Ezreal tends to do a lot better than War Mother's Control. So for example, you know, like I said, a lot has changed in the meta in the past like 5 days or so, and that's going to be, for example, like Barrier Challenger coming up in value. That's going to be Karma Lux being, you know, more prevalent as well. And also Ephemeral Midrange kind of being like a new thing on the scene. Hard to tell if it's a fad yet. It could be, but I think it's a pretty powerful deck personally. And these 3 new decks are stuff that wasn't really being run on the meta just like even like 5 days or a week ago, and Ezreal does better against all of those decks than War Mother's Control. So that's the reason for that discrepancy there. I know it probably seems, I understand it might be like, well, Swim, you like the Ezreal deck is your deck, and you know, I mean, so are you maybe just a little biased? And I'm not. I mean, I guess you can never say. I try as hard as possible not to be, and I talk with a ton of other players. The reason I bumped him to like tier 2 for a second was just because I was like, you know, I want to make sure that I'm not over-representing this. And, you know, it's like, as much as I liked him at tier 1, I wasn't quite sure. I hadn't talked to enough people yet. But, I mean, a lot of top players agree that Ezreal's tier 1. Not every top player, of course, but a lot of top players agree that Ezreal does end up being that tier 1 deck right now in the current meta that we see. Okay, so then next up we have the, you know, Elusives deck with, you know, Wayfinder. This is the Zed deck, and this has a high win rate, 61.2%, just as high as it was the week before. This is one of the higher win rates in the meta, and hey, that's why it's a tier 1 deck. I put a video out on YouTube saying like this is probably what I would recommend in general, the best deck to climb with right now. It does extremely well, and you know, not much more to say about this one. It's just a really good deck. Here's Nox's PNZ, and this is, you know, the kind of burn deck I was talking about, Champless Burn, that kind of was popular. Again, these play rates are a little dated. I think that the play rate of this deck, if you were to measure, like, today, it would probably be, like, down here somewhere. It would be, you know, it gets played, but not very much at all right now. And you can kind of see why, like, the win rate is starting to drop steeply. Like, it doesn't win to War Mother's Control. It has the ability to beat Ezreal, but it's unfavored against, like, most other decks in general. It's like, it beats Ezreal, and it's probably favored against, like, Elusives, but it's unfavored against, like, just most random stuff. And there's a lot of just, like, you know, as much as these 2 decks are getting played, there's a lot of other things just, like, floating around, right? Okay. Next up, Demacia SI Hecarim. So all the Hecarim decks tend to be getting roughly like 57-58% win rate. That's been true for the past couple of weeks now. And this is kind of no exception. Right now, you can see, you know, we're at 57, just kind of holding our win rate pattern. We're not really changing anything. It's a deck that's definitely been feeling like it's fallen off a little bit, I guess. You know, I mean, the Wayfinder deck is probably more powerful at this point in time, and that was probably true like a week ago as well. It was like pretty close, and that's why I didn't make a video saying, hey, you should all play Demacia SI. This is a very powerful deck. It's definitely getting a little bit phased out. It's still a tier 1 deck. Heimerdinger Karma actually stands pretty strong at 58.2%. And of course, you know, this is just kind of a byproduct of how things have changed in the past week. Basically, while it's a pretty strong list, the increase of play rate of stuff like barrier decks, stuff like aggro decks, I think are going to keep this like down just a little bit. I mean, right now the 3 things at the top of tier 2 could all be bumped up to tier 1. Uh-oh, my tab just crashed. That's not right. Which are Spider Aggro, Karma Lux, and Heimerdinger Karma. You know, these are 3 powerful decks that in theory could be bumped up to tier 1. You might see that next week, but right now I just want to be a little bit careful. Even though it does have a high win rate, you know, it's a low games played, I don't think it's going to have like the meta stability it needs to have like 2,000 games played and maintain win rate, especially as, you know, there's a lot of decks coming in that are going to fluctuate it, and it's definitely been falling off for the past week pretty hard. Okay, Ionia SI, and this is, of course, Spooky Karma, 51, ouch. And, of course, that's, you know, why we see it down where it is. So, it's a deck that, again, was performing really well for the first day or two of the patch, and it's fallen off quicker and harder than most. Very, very similar to, you know, the Nox PZ burn in terms of win rate. Not really a lot to recommend there. But the Karma Lux, on the other hand, of course, is on the rise. Karma Lux is doing pretty well. I think it's only been growing in popularity from the past, like, 5 days or so. So, I'm not sure if we can... this one, I don't want to, like, read too much into, just because, like, out of all the decks, Karma Lux is the one that has seen a lot of attention and been taking a lot of changes in the past, like, 5 days since this snapshot was collected. So, Karma Lux... actually a bit of a mystery for me right now. That's a deck that I haven't really played a ton or seen a ton of, but it is a powerful deck. So this is Spider Aggro. Oh, that's crazy. 62.3% win rate. A very, very, very high win rate. And this one actually kind of came out of left field for a lot of us. I was talking with a lot of people, and pretty much everybody was surprised that Spider Aggro had this high of a win rate. Like, there were a few people that were like, you know, I knew spiders were pretty good, but like overall, like, the highest win rate we've covered so far, the highest win rate in the top 20, nobody really expected that. So, what this means is right now they're tenuously at the top of tier 2. I'm going to mess around with the list a little bit. We're going to see if it's just getting like a little bit of surprise value, or maybe something needs to be changing in terms of like how the list is structured. But I think this is definitely a potential tier 1 deck. Okay, then we've got PNZ SI, that's the Elise Hecarim. This is effectively, it's kind of just the same deck as Demacia SI. It's just running, instead of like the Relentless Pursuits, you're running like Mystic Shots and stuff like that. And, I mean, it does pretty well, but as you can see, like I was saying before, it's just every version of this deck has like 57-58% win rate. It's going to be basically the same. I think as people learned more and more how to play against the Rally version, you know, it's fallen off a tiny bit, but I mean 57-58, they're gonna be effectively the same. You don't want to like draw conclusions based on like 1 or 2% differences and stuff like this, especially when sample size is high but not like, you know, incredibly high. And then we've got Demacia Ionia, and of course this is going to be the pretty standard like aggro elusive burn list. This one is still hanging in there. This is at 56%, but it is fallen down, and as we can see, we have the Karma Lux version that is actually, it's not too similar of a deck, but they have a lot of the same core package, and this one is going to be standing stronger. And that is why Elusive Burn ended up also being removed from my list, as I think a better way of playing the concept does end up being Karma Lux. They're kind of like plan B of the control-y game plan, just ends up being stronger, I think, here. Okay, I want to talk about like win rates, and I want to talk about surprise value and stuff like that really quick, because again, it probably looks to you guys like I'm going through this, and it's like, well, Swim, isn't win rate the only thing that should matter? How is, even though Spiders has the highest win rate, how is it not tier 1? And I want to clarify, metas are very, very complicated, and the entire idea of a tier list is more of a measurement of stability rather than win rate. For example, let's say people realize Spiders are really good, right? Largely because of these stats getting published, and so let's say there's a lot of Spiders in the next day or so on ladder. Suddenly, every Demacia deck just runs like one Judgment, and Spiders have literally no way of dealing with Judgment. It's really, really hard to even put ways of dealing with Judgment in that deck, right? Like, they just can't really kill you early enough, and they always have to attack into you with everything, right? So suddenly, Spider's win rate just drops, right? And that's kind of what I mean by surprise value. It's not necessarily like the opponent's like, oh, what's this deck? I've never seen this before. No. I mean, like, surprising the meta, right? Like, the meta not being prepared for it. And, yeah, like, right now, So what I like to say is, as the play rate of a deck goes up, the win rate will always go down. And different decks will have different ratios on that, but that's always going to be true. Always. Which means that the question is this stable? Is this, if it gets more popular, will it still maintain this win rate? And to a degree it will, and to a degree it won't. And that's what we need to figure out, right? That's why I can't call this a tier 1 deck yet. It's getting a lot of surprise value. I think people are going to be more and more aware that this is a powerful deck now that these stats have been published. So we'll see if it ends up being tier 1. You know, people will mess around with it, try to come up with an optimized version. But that's just one point I wanted to make very, very clear. And that's it. We just wanted to do, I'm just doing in this case, everything over 500 games played. So that's going to be my kind of like stat analysis of, you know, the Mobalytics stats report. Okay. And again, the analysis part is super important because it's a lot more complicated than just being like, ooh, this win rate's big. Okay, so this brings me to the final thing I wanted to talk about. Now, I do want to say, I teased this at the start. This is a work in progress. I'm going to show it to you guys as a sneak peek. It's not done yet, and this isn't backed by stats. We do not have the ability to collect match-up win rate stats yet in the game. But I've talked with, as I mentioned, about like 8 other top level players, and we ended up putting together a matchup table, right? I spent mostly it was with Bagels and Gummy, but we ended up talking with a bunch of other players as well, and just like collecting some input, tweaking some things here and there. Okay, so I'm gonna show it to you, but again, this is not ladder stats. This is just basically how a ton of different high-level players are interpreting things, and it's also an early version. This isn't on my website yet. I will put this on my website a little bit later when I feel like it's fully ready, but I wanted to give you guys a sneak peek of something I'm working on. And this is it. This is a matchup table. So for those of you guys who don't know how this format works, it is this deck on the left side has this percentage of winning against this deck on the top. So it's like row into column. So for example, Fearsome Rally, according to this, has a 60% win rate against Spider Aggro. So basically, there's not too much to talk about this. I wanted to show it off and talk about some of like some of the matchups, some of the implications. Like for example, let's compare like Spider Aggro to like Nox PNZ Aggro, just as a random example. So Spider Aggro has these win rates up here in this row, and it's pretty good. It's unfavored against a couple of things. Also, keep in mind, for the most part, the meta, I tried to list, there's some exceptions, but I tried to list like left to right is like kind of like a tier list somewhat. So like the 3 big decks are here, the 6 big decks are here, and then for the most part, these last several decks are all just kind of like fringe decks. Ephemeral Midrange is the one that's like definitely picking up steam, and this one should probably be over on the other side. But keep in mind, being able to win games in like, you know, in this quadrant is going to be more valuable because these decks are more played, right? So for example, Spider Aggro loses to Fearsome Rally, but beats both Kinko Elusives and Ezreal, which is pretty big. And it seems to be somewhat favored against Heimerdinger Karma as well. I also want to point out, by the way, there's going to be certain things on this list you're going to disagree with because everyone thinks that their specific deck is stronger than it is. Like for example, like as I was doing the Ezreal one, it was kind of hard for me because like I had to put it at 40% against Spider Aggro because I think that is gonna be like accurately how it ends up being across the board. You get any random Ezreal player and any random Spider Aggro player, and the Ezreal player will probably lose. But it's hard for me to get past like the thought of, well, I've never really had a big problem against Spider Aggro as Ezreal, but that doesn't matter. Like, I mean, everyone basically, you know, we're all good players, and we can all, you know, make sure that our matchup is a little bit less unfavored than it probably is statistically. But overall, it's important to recognize that if you're looking at your deck here, it's probably gonna seem a little bit lower than you think it is. Okay, so the comparison. Spider Aggro, basically, it wins a lot of valuable matchups here. It loses to Fearsome Rally. You know, I think it might actually end up being like 45% against the Ephemeral mid-range, but that's a deck that's still in development, so we're gonna have to see how that works. Overall, it's pretty close to even, and it's got pretty good win rates, although it loses a bit of ground against like some of this stuff that you don't really see anywhere. And then you compare it to like Nox PZ Aggro, and one of the things is like in doing the matchup tables, I think, as I was mentioning before, the reason I cut Nox PZ Aggro is I do think it just has worse matchups than Spider Aggro against pretty much everything, right? Like, there's gonna be a couple of matchups. I think there was one matchup where it was better. I think it actually lost that matchup. I think in an early version, when we went through the first time, there was like one matchup where Nox PZ Aggro was better than Spider Aggro, and realistically, I mean, there might be. The thing is, we're rounding, right? It's rounding to the nearest 5, which means, you know, maybe Nox PZ Aggro is like 42% against Barrier Demacia, and Spider Aggro is like 38% against it. I'm ass pulling some random example, but the point is, you know, it's gonna be kind of about the same or worse in most matchups, which is why I wouldn't really recommend this list right now. Again, it's a meta, it's very complicated, it's like an ecosystem. Things are gonna change, and no deck is necessarily strictly better than another deck, but in terms of like what it's fighting against right now, it just ends up being worse than Spider Aggro. Anyway, I just wanted to give you guys a bit of a preview on something that I'm cooking up in the works. Should be pretty exciting when I'm able to bring this to the site. And that's going to be it for this week's Meta Mondays report. We're done. We have basically just, you know, spend the time, you know, covering, to recap real quick. These are probably like the 4 tier 1 decks, and as we can see, there's a lot of Shadow Isles, and I guess I would say a lot of Freljord, although that's a little disingenuous, just because like Kinko Elusives is like, it's most popular to run this with Freljord, but you really can run it with several different things. For the most part, like, Shadow Isles and Ionia are the ones with, like, 2 very distinct representations here. And, of course, you know, the Fearsome deck is, I don't want to say on its way out. I mean, it's still a very powerful deck, but as more and more people are playing Ephemeral mid-range, and as Ephemeral mid-range will, I think, start to generate similar tables to Fearsome Rally, it might end up being played quite a bit less than Ephemeral mid-range. We will see. That's a bit of a prediction. And then we've got a few decks that are on the rise that are kind of like potential decks that I'm not sure about. And these are mostly these 4, like Spider Aggro, Karma Lux, Heimerdinger Karma, Barrier Challenger. These are 4 big potential decks, not too certain what to do with yet, and a couple of decks on their way out. Most notably, like the hard control archetype just has such a hard time working long-term in Legends of Runeterra. Alright guys, that's going to be it for this week's Meta Mondays. I'm sorry this one was on Tuesday again. Hopefully that's not going to be the case moving forward. Alright, later boys.